I remember the exact moment I realized my mother was dying, not because anyone said it aloud, but because my sister Helen started calling more often. Her voice always bright and casual, asking about Mom's appetite, her sleep, whether she seemed tired after her walks. And I would answer these questions while standing in my mother's kitchen, watching her move slowly from the counter to the table with her tea, her hands steady enough but slower than they used to be. And Helen would say, "Oh good, oh that's good, I'm so glad she's keeping her strength up." And there would be this small pause, barely noticeable, before she'd ask if Mom had mentioned anything about her accounts lately, or if she'd said anything about the house, and I would say no, not really. Why? And Helen would laugh a little and say, "Oh nothing, just wondering, you know how she is about paperwork." And then we'd talk about something else entirely, her kids or the weather or some restaurant she'd been to. But that pause would stay with me long after we hung up, sitting in my chest like something I'd swallowed wrong. My mother was 79 and had been diagnosed with what the doctors called a manageable condition, something about her heart that required monitoring and medication and a certain amount of rest. Nothing immediately threatening, they said, but also nothing that would get better, and she had taken the news the way she took most things, with a slight nod and a question about whether she could still have her morning coffee. And the doctor had smiled and said, of course, in moderation, and my mother had looked satisfied with that. But I had watched her face very carefully in the weeks that followed and seen how she would sometimes stop mid-sentence and put her hand to her chest, not in pain exactly, more like she was checking for something, making sure it was still there, still working. And she never mentioned these moments, and so neither did I. Helen lived 4 hours away in a bigger house than mine, in a neighborhood where the lawns were kept very green and the mailboxes all matched. And she had always been the organized one, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and made spreadsheets for family vacations we took when we were younger. Back when Dad was alive and money felt like something that simply existed without anyone needing to think about it too much. And now she had 2 teenagers and a husband named Derek, who worked in something financial that I never fully understood despite his many attempts to explain it. At Thanksgiving dinners, his hands moving in broad gestures that seemed designed to convey both complexity and confidence. And Helen would watch him with this expression of pride and agreement, nodding at the right moments, and I would nod too, though I was never quite sure what I was agreeing to. I lived 20 minutes from my mother, in a smaller house that I'd bought during what my ex-husband used to call my impulsive phase, though I'd always thought of it as just trying to build something of my own. And I worked as a coordinator at a non-profit that paid enough to cover my mortgage and groceries and not much else. And I had never felt particularly bothered by this until recently, until I started noticing how Helen would glance around my living room when she visited, her eyes moving over the furniture that didn't quite match and the walls that I kept meaning to repaint. And she would say things like, "Oh, you've really made it cozy in here," with an emphasis on cozy that made it sound like a consolation prize. And I would smile and offer her tea and not say anything about the way her SUV in my driveway looked like it cost more than everything I owned combined. The visits started happening more frequently after Mom's diagnosis. Helen driving up on weekends with containers of soup she'd made or books she thought Mom might enjoy. And she would sit at the kitchen table with Mom for hours talking about her kids and their college plans, how expensive everything was becoming, how she and Derek were doing their best to save, but it felt impossible sometimes. And Mom would listen and nod and make sympathetic sounds. And I would sit there too, usually with some excuse about needing to fix something in the house or run an errand later. And I would watch Helen's face as she talked, how it would shift into something softer and more vulnerable when she mentioned money, how she would reach across the table and touch Mom's hand and say, "We're managing, of course. We always do, but it's just a lot sometimes, you know." And Mom would squeeze her hand back and say, "I know, sweetheart, I know." Mom's house was the same house we'd grown up in, a modest 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that had gotten more desirable over the years without anyone really planning for it. And I knew without anyone telling me that it was worth significantly more now than when my parents had bought it in the 1970s, back when this area was considered too far out, too quiet, too unremarkable. And now there were young families moving in and renovating and putting up those sleek modern mailboxes that looked nothing like ours. And sometimes I would see Helen looking at these new houses when she visited, her eyes assessing, calculating, and she would say something like, "This neighborhood really has changed, hasn't it?" Almost like she was surprised, like she was discovering it for the first time, even though she'd grown up here too, even though she'd driven these streets just as many times as I had. I had never thought of myself as someone who cared about money, not in any deliberate way. I paid my bills and saved what I could and tried not to compare myself to people like Helen and Derek, who seemed to move through the world with this easy assumption that expensive things were simply part of life, that everyone wanted granite countertops and yearly vacations and cars that didn't make strange noises on the highway. But lately I'd been thinking about it more, thinking about how I'd chosen this life, this smaller, simpler version, and whether that choice had been noble or just naive, whether I'd been principled or just afraid. And these thoughts would come to me at strange times, while I was washing dishes or sitting in traffic or lying in bed at night listening to the house settle around me. And I didn't like them much, didn't like what they suggested about who I was or who I was becoming. Mom had been a teacher before she retired. Elementary school, 2nd grade. and she used to come home with stories about her students that made them sound like tiny philosophers. And Dad had worked in insurance, something steady and unremarkable that had paid for our childhoods and our college educations in this house. And they had never seemed wealthy but also never seemed to struggle. They existed in that middle space that felt secure and permanent. And after Dad died 6 years ago, Mom had continued existing in that same space, paying her bills from his pension and her savings and never mentioning numbers or accounts or anything that felt too specific. And neither Helen nor I had asked because it seemed rude somehow. Seemed like the kind of thing you didn't talk about with your mother while she was still healthy and living her life. But now Mom wasn't quite as healthy, and the question of what would happen felt closer, more real, more urgent, and I could feel it in the room whenever the three of us were together. This presence that no one acknowledged. This thing we were all thinking about but pretending not to think about. And it made every conversation feel slightly off, slightly wrong, like we were all reading from a script that didn't quite match what we actually wanted to say. And I found myself watching Helen more carefully, noticing how she would steer conversations toward practical matters, doctor's appointments and medication schedules, and whether Mom had updated her will recently. That last question delivered so casually that it almost sounded like an afterthought, and Mom would say, "Oh, I think so. Yes, I should check on that." And Helen would nod and say, "Well, no rush of course." So measured something that so keep in mind, and her vision with some cueing with, so some with some of some, so some of basis some of so come so some make so make so may main so can breathe and so mem and fully so explain so can form and so and was son and so can man and can so I sucked at the when what I can what we so sick with the papo a smile light up I do with bless self work with walk with what I walk I fell I saw so hold to flew I could wolf go slow is emphasis with it with a book as a with spell what's from go with this spell with never feel this I started spending more time at Mom's house, dropping by after work with groceries or just to sit with her while she watched her evening shows. And these visits felt like both a genuine desire to be with her and also something else, something more defensive, like I was marking territory, making sure Helen couldn't claim to be the only one who cared, the only one who showed up. And I hated this feeling, hated that I was thinking in terms of claims and territory when my mother was just sitting there asking if I wanted tea, asking about my day, existing in her normal way while I tallied invisible points in my head. And sometimes she would look at me with this expression that might have been knowing or might have been nothing at all, and I could never tell which. Helen started mentioning her financial troubles more openly, not complaining exactly but letting it be known that things were tight, that Derek's company had been downsizing, that the kids' college funds weren't where they needed to be, that their mortgage was larger than they'd anticipated. And she would say these things while doing dishes in Mom's kitchen or folding Mom's laundry, her hands busy, her tone light, and I would listen and make sympathetic noises and wonder what she wanted me to say, what response she was fishing for. And Mom would listen too, her face soft with concern. And she would say things like, "Oh honey, that sounds stressful. You're handling it all so well." And Helen would smile and say, "We're fine. Really, we'll figure it out. We always do. But it would be nice to have a little cushion, you know, just for security, just to breathe a little easier." And Mom would nod and look thoughtful, and I would feel something twist in my stomach, something ugly and watchful. I thought about saying something, about addressing it directly, about asking Helen what exactly she was doing, what she expected Mom to do with this information about her finances. But every time I considered it, the words felt too aggressive, too accusatory, like I would be making something explicit that everyone had agreed to keep implicit. And I worried that saying anything would make me look paranoid or selfish, would make it seem like I was the one with ulterior motives when all I wanted was for Mom to be left alone, to not feel pressured, to not spend her last years feeling responsible for problems that weren't hers to solve. Or maybe that wasn't all I wanted. Maybe I also wanted to make sure that whatever Mom had stayed exactly where it was, untouched, saved, preserved for some future purpose that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Mom started talking about simplifying, about how she didn't need such a big house anymore, about how it was too much work to maintain, too many rooms she never used. And Helen would immediately say, "Oh no Mom, you love this house. You've been here forever. You can't leave." And her voice would be so earnest, so full of apparent concern, but I knew what she was really thinking. Knew she was calculating what would happen if Mom downsized, where the money from the sale would go, whether it would disappear into living expenses or assisted care or some other thing that would reduce what was left at the end. And I would say nothing during these conversations, would just sit there with my tea getting cold in my hands, watching both of them, feeling like a referee who had forgotten the rules. Sometimes I would imagine what it would be like if there was nothing, if Mom spent every last dollar on herself, on her care, on small luxuries and comfortable final years. If she left us nothing but the memory of her and some photo albums and maybe a few pieces of furniture we'd have to argue over. And the thought should have felt noble, should have felt like the right way to think. but instead it filled me with something close to panic. This realization that I had been counting on something without admitting I was counting on it, that some part of me had been planning around an inheritance I had no right to expect. And this realization made me feel small and ashamed and also defensive, because hadn't I been the one who stayed close, who visited regularly, who would presumably be the one handling everything when the time came, and didn't that mean something? Didn't that count for something? And I hated these thoughts but couldn't stop having them. Derek started coming along on Helen's visits, which he hadn't done as regularly before, and he would walk through Mom's house with this casual assessing quality, mentioning things that needed fixing, the roof that looked like it might need replacing soon, the water heater that was probably original, the windows that weren't energy efficient, and he would frame all of this as concern, as helpful observations. But I could hear the subtext, could hear him calculating the cost of repairs, the burden of maintenance, the way these problems would affect the eventual value, and Mom would listen to him with this patient expression, nodding along, and I wanted to tell him to stop, to say that these things were none of his business, but I didn't because that would have sounded irrational, would have required me to explain why I was so bothered by himself, or it would have forced me to admit what we were all actually talking about. Helen started bringing up the idea of power of attorney, casually, over coffee, saying it was just something to think about. Just a practical matter for medical decisions and bill paying if Mom ever needed help. And she had already looked into it, had printed out some forms, had highlighted the places that needed signatures, and she explained it all so efficiently, so competently, that it almost seemed unreasonable to question it. And Mom said, "Oh, well, that makes sense, I suppose," and looked at the forms with this tired expression. And I heard myself saying, "Wait, maybe we should talk about this more. Maybe Mom needs time to think." And Helen looked at me with surprise and said, "Of course, obviously, I'm just trying to be helpful. I'm just trying to make sure things are organized." And her voice had this edge of hurt feelings, this implication that I was being difficult for no reason. And Mom said, "It's fine, girls, I'll look at it. There's no rush." And she set the forms aside, but I saw Helen's face, saw the flash of irritation before she smoothed it away, and I felt something shift between us, something that had maybe always been there but was now visible, undeniable. I started researching inheritance law late at night, reading articles about wills and trusts and estate planning, learning vocabulary I'd never needed before, learning about how these things worked, about what happened when there was no will or an outdated will or multiple beneficiaries with conflicting interests. And it all felt so mercenary, so grotesque, reading about my mother's potential death in legal terms, in financial frameworks, but I couldn't stop, couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to understand the rules of whatever game we were playing, even though no one had officially announced we were playing a game at all. And if you're listening to this and recognizing something in your own family, in your own careful conversations that circle around what no one wants to say, maybe subscribe, because these stories, these quiet, heavy things, they need to be told, they need to be witnessed. And sometimes knowing you're not alone in this way, its way is the only comfort there is. And sometimes knowing you're not alone, and sometimes and some samsquen with their saps and some zones and where is there as they are, as if there is where I saw for with them on or time up, and I'm but or what Mum seemed tired more often, napping in the afternoons, moving more slowly, and the doctor said this was normal, expected, nothing to panic about, but also nothing that would reverse itself. And during one visit, Helen asked Mom directly if she'd thought more about the house, about what she wanted to happen with it, and Mom said, "Oh, eventually I suppose we'll need to discuss all that, but not now. I'm not ready to think about it now." And Helen said, "Of course not. Of course, I wasn't suggesting anything immediate. I just want to make sure we're on the same page when the time comes." And I watched Mom's face as Helen said this, watched her close her eyes for just a moment, this tiny flinch, and I wondered if she understood what was happening, if she could feel us circling her, polite and concerned and calculating, or if she was choosing not to understand, choosing to believe in our good intentions because the alternative was too lonely, too sad. We had a family dinner, the 5 of us, Mom and Helen and Derek and their 2 kids who were mostly interested in their phones. And Derek made a toast to family and Mom smiled and we all drank, and the conversation was pleasant and normal, and I felt like I was watching it from outside myself. Watching us perform this ritual of togetherness while underneath everything felt transactional, conditional, like we were all waiting for something to happen, for some signal that would tell us what to do next. And at one point Helen caught my eye across the table and smiled, and I smiled back, and we both knew, I think, that we were not really smiling at each other. Not really, we were just doing what was expected, maintaining the performance. And later when I was helping Mum with the dishes, she said quietly, without looking at me, "You girls will work it out when the time comes, won't you?" And I said, "Of course, Mom. Of course we will." And she nodded but didn't seem convinced, and neither was I. Helen called me directly for the first time in weeks. Not asking about Mom, but asking about me, about whether I'd thought about my own future, about my own security, about what I would do if something happened and I needed help. And I said I was fine. I was managing, and she said, "I know, but it's smart to plan ahead, to think about these things." And I waited because I knew there was more coming. And she said, "I've been thinking that maybe when the time comes it would make sense for me and Derek to handle the estate stuff, the paperwork and the sale and all of that, because we have more experience with these things. And you're so busy with work, and it would be one less thing for you to worry about." And her voice was so reasonable, so generous, so clearly framing this as a favor she was offering to do for me. And I said, "I think we should both be involved. I think that's what Mum would want." And there was a pause, a long one. And Helen said, "Of course, yes, absolutely. I just meant practically speaking, logistically, but yes, of course." And we hung up shortly after, and I sat there feeling like I'd just defended something without knowing exactly what. Mum fell one afternoon, nothing serious, just lost her balance getting out of bed, bruised her hip, scared herself more than anything, and I got the call from her neighbor who'd heard the noise and had a key. And by the time I arrived, Helen was already there somehow, already organizing things, already talking about how this proved Mom needed more help, more supervision, maybe someone coming by daily, or maybe a different living situation entirely, something safer, more managed. And Mom was sitting on the couch looking small and embarrassed and tired, and she kept saying, "I'm fine. It was just a silly mistake. I'm fine." But Helen wasn't listening, was already making calls to home health agencies, already researching facilities. And I watched this happen and felt paralyzed. Felt unable to argue because what Helen was saying wasn't wrong exactly. Mom did need more support, but the speed of it, the efficiency, the way Helen had pivoted immediately to permanent solutions, it felt less like care and more like strategy, like she was accelerating something, preparing for something. And I couldn't prove it, but I felt it in my bones. The home health aide started coming 3 times a week, a nice woman named Patricia who helped with bathing and medications and light housekeeping. And Mom seemed to like her well enough, though she also seemed diminished somehow. Like accepting this help meant accepting something larger about herself, about where she was heading. And Helen had arranged it all, had found Patricia, had set up the payment system, had established herself as the primary contact. And whenever I visited, Patricia would mention something Helen had told her to do or watch for, and I would nod and feel like a secondary character in my own mother's life, like I had been gently moved aside without anyone actually asking me to move. I asked Mom directly one evening, just the two of us, if she'd made any decisions about her will, about what she wanted to happen. And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Not really, honey. I suppose I should." And I said, "I think it would help. I think it would make everything clearer." And she said, "Clearer for who?" And I didn't have a good answer for that. And she smiled a little sadly and said, "Don't worry so much. It'll all work itself out. These things always do." And I wanted to tell her that they don't, that they really don't, that families fall apart over this exact kind of vagueness. But I couldn't say it, couldn't put that weight on her. So I just nodded and changed the subject and felt the opportunity close like a door I'd never be able to open again. Helen suggested selling Mom's car since she wasn't driving anymore, and Mom agreed because it made sense, because the car was just sitting there. And Helen handled the sale and deposited the money into Mom's account and mentioned casually that she'd helped Mom set up online banking so things would be easier to manage. And I didn't find out about any of this until weeks later. Didn't know Helen had that level of access, and when I asked Mom about it, she seemed confused by my concern, said Helen was just helping, said it was easier this way. And I felt like I was losing ground, like Helen was building infrastructure around Mom that I wasn't part of. And maybe that was intentional, or maybe I was being paranoid, but either way I felt the balance shifting. Felt myself becoming less central, less necessary. Christmas came and we spent it at Mom's house, all of us together. We opened presents and ate too much and took photos that would look normal later, that would look like a family that loved each other without complication. And at one point I was in the kitchen with Helen and she said, "I think this might be the last one, the last Christmas here." And I said, "Why would you say that?" And she said, "Just a feeling, just how Mom seems." And there was this horrible moment where we both stood there not looking at each other, both knowing what she meant, what she was predicting. And I felt sick, felt angry, felt like she was willing it into being by saying it out loud. And I left the kitchen without responding and she didn't follow me. And later when I was leaving, Mom hugged me longer than usual and said, "I'm glad you came, honey. I'm glad you're here." And I realized she'd probably heard Helen's comment, probably knew what we'd been talking about. And I drove home feeling like I'd failed her somehow, like I'd participated in something terrible just by being there. The new year came and Mom seemed weaker, sleeping more, eating less. And the doctor adjusted her medications and said we should think about comfort measures, about quality of life. And Helen immediately started researching hospice care, started making calls, started preparing, and I couldn't argue because it was the right thing to do. It was what needed to happen. But I also felt like Helen was stage managing Mom's death, organizing it, optimizing it. And I wondered if Mom felt that too, if she could sense the way we were both hovering, both waiting, both calculating in our different ways what came next. Patricia stopped coming because Mom qualified for hospice now, and a new nurse came instead. Someone gentle and professional who talked about pain management and dignity. And Mom seemed to accept this transition with a kind of resignation that broke my heart. And Helen and I took turns staying with her, sleeping in the guest room, being there. And during these nights I would sometimes wake up and go check on Mom and find Helen already there, sitting in the chair by the bed, just watching Mom sleep. And I never knew what to make of that. Never knew if it was love or vigil or something else entirely. Mom died on a Tuesday morning in February, quietly, with both of us there. And it was peaceful, they said. As peaceful as these things can be. And for a few hours afterward, Helen and I just sat together, not talking, not doing anything, just being with the fact of it. And it felt like maybe we could grieve together, could be sisters again in the simple way we'd been before all of this. But then Helen's phone rang and she stepped out to answer it, and when she came back she had this look on her face. This shift back into practical mode, and she said we should call the funeral home, we should start making arrangements. And I nodded, and the moment passed and we were back to being whatever we'd become. The funeral was small and nice, and people said kind things about Mom, about how she'd been a wonderful teacher, a devoted mother, a good person, and it was all true, and also felt beside the point somehow. Felt like we were describing someone else's mother, someone else's life. And afterward at Mom's house people ate sandwiches and told stories, and Helen and I played hostess together, refilling drinks, accepting condolences, and we were good at it. We were very good at playing our parts. The lawyer's office was downtown, a place with wood paneling and serious furniture. And Helen and I sat across from a man who had known Mom slightly, who had helped her update her will 3 years ago apparently, though neither of us had known this. And he read the document aloud in that formal way lawyers do. And the house was to be split between us equally, and Mom's savings were to be split between us equally. And there were some small bequests to charities Mom had cared about, and that was it. That was everything. And it was fair. It was completely fair. And Helen looked satisfied and I felt nothing. Felt this enormous absence of feeling. And we signed papers and shook hands and walked out into the parking lot together. Helen said, well, that's settled then. And I said yes. And she said we should probably list the house soon. The market's good right now. And I said maybe we should wait a little while. And she said wait for what? And I didn't answer because I didn't know. I just knew I wasn't ready to erase Mom's house, Mom's life, to convert it into money and division and closure. But I also knew Helen was right. Knew waiting was just delaying the inevitable. And we stood there by our cars and the silence stretched out, and finally Helen said we'll figure it out. We'll talk soon. And I said okay, and we both drove away in different directions. The house is still sitting there, still full of Mom's things. And Helen calls every few days asking when I'm going to start clearing it out, when we can get a realtor in there, when we can move forward. And I say soon. I say I'm working on it, but I'm not really. I'm just going over there and sitting in Mom's kitchen and looking at everything and feeling this weight that I can't name. This sense that we broke something, that Helen and I broke something between us and with Mom, that we turned her final years into a quiet negotiation, a careful dance around what we wanted but couldn't say. And now she's gone and we got exactly what we were supposed to get, exactly what was fair, and it feels like nothing. It feels worse than nothing, and I don't know what to do with that. Don't know how to fix it or if it even can be fixed. I just know that when I sit in that empty house I can still feel all of us there, still feel the weight of everything we didn't say, still hear the silences that filled the spaces between our careful words. And sometimes I think about calling Helen and asking if she feels it too, asking if she knows what we did, asking if she regrets any of it, but I never do. I never call. I just sit there in the quiet and wait for something to resolve itself, though I suspect nothing will. I suspect this is how it ends, with both of us getting what we wanted and neither of us able to enjoy it, with Mom's house sitting empty between us like evidence of something neither of us wants to examine too closely. And the thought that maybe this is just how families are, maybe this is just what happens when people get old and sick and death gets close enough to see clearly. Maybe everyone goes through this same quiet terrible thing and no one talks about it, and so we all just carry it separately, in private, like I'm carrying it now.